The moment power forgets humility, justice begins taking notes. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through Miller's diner just after 7 on a cool autumn morning, wrapping itself around quiet conversations, clinking coffee mugs, and the soft crackle of bacon on the grill. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where regulars claimed the same booths every weekday and newcomers were noticed the second they stepped through the front door. That morning, however, one unfamiliar face drew more attention than anyone realized. Sitting alone near the window was a tall black man in his early 50s wearing a charcoal sport coat over a simple blue button-down shirt. His polished shoes rested neatly beneath the table, and a folded newspaper lay beside a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. He looked calm, almost invisible, offering a warm smile whenever the waitress refilled his coffee. "Thank you, ma'am," he said with effortless kindness. Sarah Whitmore, who had owned the diner for nearly 20 years, smiled back. "You're not from around here, are you?" The man chuckled softly. "Just passing through." It was a truthful answer, though not the complete one. Outside, the small town was already waking up. Pickup trucks rolled past the courthouse square, flags fluttered gently above brick storefronts, and the sheriff's department SUV cruised slowly along Main Street like it always did every morning. In a place where routine rarely changed, unfamiliar faces often became subjects of curiosity before they became neighbors. Inside the diner, conversations continued without much concern until the bell above the entrance gave a sharp metallic ring. The room seemed to change before anyone even looked up. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stepped inside with the confidence of a man who believed every building in town belonged to him. His polished badge reflected the morning sunlight spilling through the windows, and several customers greeted him with respectful nods. He acknowledged them with quick smiles before his eyes settled on the stranger sitting quietly by the window. For a brief moment, everything else disappeared from his attention. Sarah noticed it immediately. She had seen that expression before. It was the look Daniel wore whenever he convinced himself something was wrong before asking a single question. Marcus Ellington calmly buttered another piece of toast, completely unaware, or perhaps completely unconcerned, that every step of the sheriff's approach was being watched by the entire restaurant. Boots echoed across the tile floor. Conversations faded into whispers. Even the cook glanced through the kitchen pass-through window. Sheriff Brooks stopped beside the table and looked down without introducing himself. "Morning," Marcus said politely, meeting his eyes with an easy smile. "Beautiful town you have here." The sheriff ignored the greeting. "Mind telling me what brings you here?" Marcus folded his newspaper carefully before answering. "Business." "What kind of business?" "The kind that starts after breakfast." A few people exchanged uncertain glances. The answer sounded harmless enough, yet it somehow irritated the sheriff even more. "You carrying identification?" Marcus took another sip of coffee before responding with remarkable patience. "I'd prefer to finish my meal first, if that's all right." Silence settled over the diner. Someone quietly set down a coffee mug. A chair creaked. Sarah instinctively took one cautious step forward before stopping herself. Sheriff Brooks crossed his arms. That wasn't a request. Marcus looked at him steadily. There was no fear in his expression, no challenge either. Only composure. "Officer," he said gently, "I promise this morning doesn't have to become more complicated than it already is." Those words landed differently than anyone expected. The sheriff interpreted them as defiance. Marcus intended them as a final opportunity. Without another question, Sheriff Brooks instructed Marcus to stand. Curious eyes followed every movement as Marcus slowly rose from his seat without protest. He carefully placed his napkin beside his untouched breakfast and quietly pushed in his chair. "I'm cooperating," he said in the same calm voice that had never risen above ordinary conversation. Yet calmness often sounds suspicious to people who have already made up their minds. Within seconds, the sheriff placed handcuffs on Marcus in full view of everyone inside the diner. A few gasps escaped from nearby tables. Sarah opened her mouth as if to object, but hesitated, uncertain whether speaking would help or only make things worse. Marcus never resisted. He simply looked around the room, meeting frightened eyes with quiet reassurance before turning back toward the sheriff. "You still have one chance to stop this," he said softly. Sheriff Brooks answered with complete certainty. "Around here, I decide who belongs." Marcus lowered his eyes for just a moment, almost as though he felt disappointment rather than anger. Outside, several blocks away, a line of dark government SUVs turned onto Main Street, their destination only minutes away. Inside Miller's diner, no one noticed them yet. No one realized that the man standing calmly in handcuffs beside a half-finished breakfast was not an ordinary traveler passing through town. They had just placed restraints on the director of the FBI before the first cup of coffee had even gone cold. 45 minutes earlier, Main Street had carried the quiet rhythm of another ordinary weekday. The sidewalks were clean, the storefront lights had just flickered on, and the first wave of commuters stopped for coffee before work. Miller's diner stood on the corner exactly as it had for decades, its bright red sign welcoming farmers, teachers, mechanics, and families who measured time by breakfast instead of clocks. It was the kind of place where strangers usually became familiar before they finished a second cup of coffee. That morning, one stranger had arrived with no intention of attracting attention. Marcus Ellington parked a plain gray rental sedan 2 blocks away instead of driving directly to the courthouse. He preferred walking through unfamiliar towns before attending official meetings. It gave him an opportunity to understand the people behind the statistics, the faces behind the reports, and the character of a community before anyone recognized his name or position. His schedule for the morning was remarkably simple. Breakfast at a local restaurant, a quiet review of briefing documents, then a private meeting with federal supervisors and municipal leaders regarding an inspection that very few people even knew was taking place. The visit had intentionally remained confidential. No public announcement had been made. No welcoming committee had been organized. Even the local government had only been informed that a senior federal official would arrive sometime before noon. Marcus preferred it that way because titles often changed how people behaved. Without them, character revealed itself naturally. As he walked through town, he noticed children waiting for their school bus, an elderly couple opening their flower shop, and volunteers arranging American flags outside the Veterans Memorial in the town square. Every small interaction mattered to him. He believed leadership was not measured inside conference rooms alone, but in ordinary places where people expected nothing in return. When he entered Miller's diner, Sarah Whitmore greeted him with the same smile she offered every customer. She had no idea who he was, and Marcus appreciated that more than she could have known. They exchanged a few friendly words before he ordered scrambled eggs, wheat toast, fresh fruit, and black coffee. While waiting for breakfast, Marcus quietly reviewed several pages inside a simple leather folder. None of the documents displayed official markings on the outside. Anyone passing by would have assumed he was reading business papers before an ordinary meeting. In reality, those pages summarized months of federal reviews concerning public trust, departmental accountability, and community relations throughout several counties, including this one. Yet Marcus spent far more time observing people than reading reports. He noticed how Sarah remembered every regular customer's favorite meal. He watched a young server patiently help an elderly veteran carry his breakfast to a booth near the window. He smiled as 2 construction workers debated college football while laughing loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Moments like these reminded him why public service existed in the first place. Laws protected communities, but kindness held them together. After a few minutes, Sarah returned with a fresh pot of coffee. "You picked a good morning to visit," she said cheerfully. "Small towns move a little slower, but folks here usually take care of each other." Marcus smiled warmly. "That is exactly what I was hoping to find." Across the room, however, not everyone shared Sarah's optimism. 2 customers quietly exchanged uncertain glances toward the unfamiliar visitor. One whispered that he had never seen the man before. The other shrugged and suggested he was probably traveling through. Neither conversation carried hostility, only curiosity. Marcus barely noticed because he had long accepted that unfamiliar faces naturally invited questions. Outside, Sheriff Daniel Brooks completed his routine patrol around the courthouse square. For years, he had built a reputation for absolute confidence in his own judgment. Many residents admired his decisiveness. Others simply accepted it because challenging local authority rarely seemed worth the trouble. Daniel sincerely believed he knew nearly every family in town, every business owner, every frequent visitor. When dispatch casually mentioned an unfamiliar vehicle parked near Main Street earlier that morning, he decided to investigate personally. It seemed insignificant, hardly worth another thought. Yet sometimes the smallest decisions quietly become the turning points people remember for years. As Daniel stepped out of his sport utility vehicle and looked toward Miller's diner, Marcus lifted his coffee cup and glanced through the window, unaware that two entirely different mornings were about to collide. One man expected nothing more than breakfast before an important meeting. The other believed he was about to question an unknown visitor. Neither realized that within minutes, the entire town would witness a moment that would challenge everything they believed about authority, respect, and the quiet difference between wearing power and earning it. Marcus Ellington had learned long ago that the strongest people in a room were rarely the loudest. Years spent serving his country had taught him that respect could never be demanded, only demonstrated. As he sat quietly inside Miller's diner waiting for his breakfast, there was nothing about his appearance that suggested he held one of the highest positions in federal law enforcement. That was intentional. He preferred simple jackets over expensive suits, practical shoes over polished displays of status, and genuine conversations over formal introductions. He believed that when titles disappeared, truth usually appeared in their place. Sarah Whitmore returned with another cup of fresh coffee and smiled. "You hardly touched your first one." Marcus laughed softly. "I have a long morning ahead of me." "Business meeting?" she asked while placing the pot back on the warmer. "Something like that," he answered. "Hopefully a productive one." Before Sarah could respond, an elderly man at the next booth struggled to steady his cane while reaching for a packet of sweetener that had slipped onto the floor. Without hesitation, Marcus stood, picked it up, and handed it back with a warm smile. "Here you are, sir." The older gentleman nodded gratefully. "Thank you, son. These old knees do not cooperate like they used to." Marcus smiled. "Mine complain more every year, too." The two shared a quiet laugh that eased the morning atmosphere. A young mother sitting nearby noticed the exchange and smiled to herself before returning to help her little daughter finish a stack of pancakes. The child looked curiously toward Marcus and waved shyly. He waved back with the same kindness he offered everyone else. There was nothing performative about it. He simply treated people the way he believed every person deserved to be treated. Sarah noticed something unusual about the quiet visitor. Most travelers spent breakfast looking at their phones or rushing through emails. Marcus barely glanced at the leather folder resting beside his newspaper. Instead, he watched people. He listened more than he spoke. Every few minutes he scribbled a short note inside a small notebook before closing it again. It was almost as if he were studying the heartbeat of the town instead of its buildings. Across the room, two construction workers prepared to leave after breakfast. One realized he had misplaced his wallet and immediately began checking every pocket with growing concern. Before panic could spread, Marcus calmly pointed toward the counter. "I believe the gentleman paying before you accidentally set it beside the cash register." Sure enough, the wallet was exactly where Marcus had noticed it moments earlier. "You just saved me a long morning," the worker said gratefully. Marcus simply nodded. "Glad it found its owner." Sarah shook her head with a smile. "You notice everything, do you?" Marcus answered carefully. "People usually tell you what matters if you are willing to pay attention." His words lingered with Sarah long after she walked away. Outside, Main Street continued its peaceful routine. School buses rolled past the diner, shop owners unlocked their front doors, and church bells echoed faintly across town. Nothing suggested that history was quietly approaching one ordinary breakfast table. Sheriff Daniel Brooks had nearly finished his patrol when dispatch mentioned an unfamiliar rental vehicle parked near the center of town. There had been no reports of criminal activity, no emergency calls, no complaints. Still, Daniel believed unfamiliar often meant suspicious until proven otherwise. Confidence had slowly become certainty over the years, and certainty had gradually become habit. He turned his vehicle toward Miller's diner without considering any other explanation. Inside the restaurant, Marcus glanced at his watch. His confidential meeting with federal personnel would begin in less than 1 hour. He expected to finish breakfast, thank Sarah for her hospitality, and quietly leave without anyone remembering his name. That plan suited him perfectly. He never wanted authority to arrive before character did. As he folded his newspaper and reached for the last piece of toast, the bell above the entrance rang sharply. Conversation slowed almost instantly. Several regular customers looked toward the doorway before offering familiar greetings. Sheriff Brooks acknowledged them with brief nods. but his attention quickly settled on the only face he did not recognize. Marcus noticed the sheriff's reflection in the diner window before he ever looked up. Their eyes met across the room for only a second. Marcus offered the same polite smile he had given everyone else that morning. Daniel did not return it. Instead, he walked directly toward the table with measured steps, convinced that he already understood the story before hearing its first sentence. Marcus quietly set his coffee cup onto its saucer, folded his hands on the table, and waited with the calm patience of a man who had spent a lifetime allowing other people to reveal themselves first. Sheriff Daniel Brooks stopped beside the booth without offering a greeting, his shadow stretching across the table where Marcus Ellington had been enjoying what should have been an ordinary breakfast. Around them, forks paused halfway to plates, coffee cups rested quietly in steady hands, and conversations dissolved into cautious silence. Small towns often developed an instinct for moments that felt different, and everyone inside Miller's Diner sensed that something important was unfolding even if no one understood why. Marcus looked up with the same calm expression he had worn since walking through the front door. "Good morning," he said politely. "It certainly is," Daniel replied, though his tone carried none of the warmth usually associated with those words. His eyes moved from Marcus to the leather folder, then to the folded newspaper, then back again, as though every ordinary object somehow confirmed a conclusion only he could see. "You are not from around here." Marcus smiled slightly. "That is true. Then tell me why you are here." "I am visiting on business." Daniel frowned. "What kind of business?" Marcus answered carefully. "The kind that will begin after I finish breakfast." Several customers exchanged uncertain looks. The answer sounded respectful, yet it was not the detailed explanation the sheriff expected. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Do you have identification?" Marcus rested both hands where they could easily be seen. "Yes, I do." "Then let me see it." Marcus glanced at the untouched portion of his breakfast before looking back at the sheriff. "I would appreciate the opportunity to finish my meal first. It will only take a few minutes." Sarah Whitmore quietly stepped behind the counter, hoping the conversation would end as quickly as it had begun. She had served enough travelers over the years to recognize courteous people, and everything about Marcus suggested patience rather than trouble. "Sheriff," she said gently, "he has been nothing but respectful this morning." Daniel barely acknowledged her. His attention remained fixed on Marcus. "I asked you a simple question." Marcus nodded. "And I answered honestly." The sheriff folded his arms. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be." Marcus met his eyes without raising his voice. "Actually, I believe we both have the opportunity to keep it simple." Those words were spoken without sarcasm or challenge. They sounded more like sincere advice than disagreement. Yet Daniel heard them differently. Confidence mixed with assumption until neither left room for curiosity. "Stand up," he ordered. Marcus slowly pushed his chair back and stood without hesitation. He did not argue. He did not protest. He simply picked up his napkin, placed it neatly beside his plate, and faced the sheriff with quiet dignity. The little girl who had waved to Marcus earlier looked up at her mother with confused eyes. "Mom, did that man do something wrong?" she whispered. Her mother could only shake her head because she did not know the answer. Marcus noticed the child and offered a reassuring smile before returning his attention to Daniel. "Officer," he said softly, "there is still time for this conversation to end well." Instead of hearing a peaceful suggestion, Daniel heard what he believed was quiet defiance. His certainty had already replaced investigation. He instructed Marcus to place his hands behind his back while several people inside the diner shifted uneasily in their seats. Sarah took another cautious step forward. "Sheriff, please," she said. "Maybe there has been a misunderstanding." Daniel answered without looking away from Marcus. "I know exactly what I am doing." Marcus remained completely cooperative. "I have no intention of creating a problem," he said evenly. "That has been clear from the moment I arrived." Deputy Ryan Collins entered through the front door after noticing the sheriff's vehicle outside. He paused just inside the entrance, surprised to find nearly every customer watching in silence. He looked at Marcus, then at Daniel, uncertain what had led to the situation. "Everything all right, Sheriff?" Daniel answered confidently. "Routine investigation." Ryan nodded, though something about the room felt unusually tense. Marcus looked toward the deputy with the same composed expression. "Good morning." Ryan quietly returned the greeting, sensing that the visitor carried himself with unusual confidence despite the circumstances. Outside, unnoticed by everyone inside the diner, 3 dark sport utility vehicles turned onto Main Street and continued steadily toward the courthouse. Their arrival drew little attention because government vehicles occasionally passed through town without attracting interest. Inside, however, another kind of momentum had already begun. Daniel believed he was demonstrating authority before his community. Marcus understood that true authority never depended on appearances. As the silence inside Miller's diner grew heavier with every passing second, no one realized they were only moments away from discovering which of those 2 ideas would endure long after breakfast was forgotten. Marcus Ellington remained standing with quiet composure while the morning around him seemed to hold its breath. The breakfast he had barely begun was growing cold on the table, yet his attention was no longer on the untouched coffee or the newspaper folded neatly beside his plate. Instead, he watched Sheriff Daniel Brooks with the steady patience of someone who understood that every decision carried consequences, even when the person making that decision could not yet see them. Deputy Ryan Collins shifted uneasily near the entrance, sensing that the situation had become far more uncomfortable than a routine conversation with a traveler. "Sheriff," Ryan said carefully, "would you like me to run his identification if he provides it?" Daniel shook his head without hesitation. "Not yet." Marcus spoke in the same measured tone that had never risen above ordinary conversation. "Officer, I have identification with me, and I have every intention of cooperating. I only asked for the opportunity to finish breakfast before we continued." Daniel answered immediately, "That opportunity has passed." Sarah Whitmore folded her hands together behind the counter, unable to hide her concern. During 20 years of serving customers, she had witnessed disagreements, misunderstandings, and difficult mornings, but this felt different. The visitor had remained respectful from the moment he walked through the front door. Even now, there was no sign of anger or resentment in his voice. "Sheriff Brooks," she said quietly, "he has not disturbed anyone. Everyone here saw that." Several customers nodded almost instinctively. The elderly veteran Marcus had helped earlier adjusted his glasses and spoke for the first time. "He has been nothing but courteous." A construction worker added, "He even helped me find my wallet a few minutes ago." Their comments hung briefly in the air before fading into another uneasy silence. Daniel acknowledged none of them. His confidence had become a wall that outside voices could no longer penetrate. Marcus looked around the diner for a brief moment, making eye contact with the people who had spoken on his behalf. He offered each of them a grateful smile before returning his attention to the sheriff. "Kindness is always worth remembering," he said softly, "especially on mornings that become difficult." Outside, the first of the dark government sport utility vehicles rolled quietly past the courthouse before slowing near the next intersection. Inside the lead vehicle, Special Agent in Charge Angela Brooks reviewed the day's confidential schedule one final time. According to the plan, Director Marcus Ellington was expected to arrive at the federal coordination meeting within the hour. When she glanced at the dashboard clock, she noticed he should have already checked in through a secure message that always accompanied his arrivals. Instead, there was only silence. She reached for her phone and placed a call. Inside Miller's diner, a faint vibration came from the inside pocket of Marcus's sport coat. The sound was brief but unmistakable. Daniel noticed it immediately. "Take the phone out slowly," he instructed. Marcus nodded. "I would rather not answer it at this moment." The phone continued vibrating for several seconds before falling silent. Daniel extended his hand. "Give it to me." Marcus hesitated only long enough to speak calmly. "That call is probably important." "Not more important than my investigation," Daniel replied. Without argument, Marcus carefully removed the phone and handed it over exactly as instructed. The screen illuminated for only an instant before going dark again. Daniel glanced at it, but did not recognize the unfamiliar government contact identification displayed a moment earlier. He simply slipped the device into his pocket, convinced it could wait. Several miles away, Angela ended the unanswered call and frowned. "That is not like him," she said quietly. Agent David Ross looked over from the driver's seat. "Should we continue to the courthouse?" Angela considered the question for only a second. "No, we stop at his last known location first." A secure tracking application confirmed the final signal had originated from Main Street, only a short distance ahead. The convoy immediately changed direction. Back inside the diner, Marcus stood as calmly as ever, showing no sign of frustration despite the growing delay. He understood exactly who had tried to reach him, and he also understood what would happen when they realized he was no longer answering. He took a slow breath before looking once more at Sheriff Brooks. "There is still an opportunity," he said gently, "for today to become a story about good judgment instead of unnecessary regret." Daniel answered with complete certainty. "The only story that matters is the one I write in this town." Neither man raised his voice, yet everyone inside Miller's diner felt the weight of those words. Outside, the dark government vehicles turned onto the final block leading toward the diner, closing the remaining distance 1 mile at a time. The first sign that something had changed arrived without sirens, without flashing lights, and without anyone inside Miller's diner realizing what it meant. Through the front window, 3 black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly onto Main Street before stopping in perfect formation across from the restaurant. Their engines idled quietly, almost disappearing beneath the ordinary sounds of the town waking up. Sheriff Daniel Brooks never bothered to look outside. His attention remained fixed on Marcus Ellington, convinced the situation in front of him required nothing more than his own authority. Deputy Ryan Collins, however, happened to glance through the glass. "Sheriff," he said cautiously, "we have company." Daniel dismissed the comment with a brief wave of his hand. "Probably another state agency passing through." Ryan nodded, but something about the vehicles felt different. Their windows were dark, their movements were coordinated, and no one stepped out immediately. It was as though every second had been carefully planned. Inside the lead vehicle, Special Agent in Charge Angela Brooks looked toward the diner entrance while reviewing the last location transmitted by the director's secure device. The signal had stopped moving several minutes earlier. She turned to Agent David Ross. "This is the place." David looked toward the crowded restaurant. "No communication since the missed call." Angela slowly shook her head. "Not a single response. That is completely out of character." Another agent quietly added, "Should we notify local authorities?" Angela looked through the windshield one more time before answering. "Not yet. First we find the director." Back inside the diner, Marcus remained perfectly composed. Even without his phone, he understood exactly what was happening outside. Years of experience had taught him that disciplined teams followed procedures instead of assumptions. They would search methodically. They would verify every detail. And sooner or later, they would walk through the front door. Sarah Whitmore noticed the unfamiliar vehicles through the window and felt an uneasy chill. "That is strange," she whispered to herself. The construction workers followed her gaze. One quietly muttered, "Looks federal." The elderly veteran sitting near the window leaned forward slightly. "Those are not ordinary government vehicles." Sheriff Brooks finally noticed several customers looking outside instead of toward him. He turned briefly, saw the parked vehicles, and shrugged with complete confidence. "Nothing to worry about," he announced. "Everyone can go back to breakfast." Nobody moved. Nobody picked up a fork. Nobody resumed their conversations. The room had become strangely still, as though every instinct told them they were standing at the edge of something much larger than they could understand. Marcus looked toward the window for only a moment before returning his attention to Daniel. "You still have an opportunity to reconsider," he said calmly. Daniel answered with the same certainty he had shown all morning. "My decisions do not change because someone else drives into town." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. That is often the difference between confidence and wisdom. Before Daniel could respond, the bell above the entrance rang once again. This time the sound echoed through absolute silence. The front door opened, and 4 men and 1 woman entered wearing dark business suits with small credential holders clipped neatly to their belts. They were not hurried. They were not loud. Their professionalism alone immediately changed the atmosphere inside the diner. Every customer instinctively stepped aside to clear a path. Angela Brooks scanned the room only once before her eyes settled on Marcus. For the first time since arriving in town, her calm expression shifted. "Director Ellington," she called clearly, her voice carrying across the restaurant. Every sound inside the diner disappeared. Coffee cups froze halfway to tables. Sarah covered her mouth in stunned disbelief. Deputy Ryan Collins looked from Marcus to the agents, then back again as realization spread across his face. Daniel Brooks frowned, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Angela walked directly toward Marcus and stopped only a few feet away. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked with unmistakable respect. Marcus answered with the same quiet composure he had maintained from the beginning. "I am fine, Angela. Thank you for coming." Another agent immediately presented official federal identification without raising his voice. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said professionally. "We are here for Director Marcus Ellington." Daniel stared at the credentials, then at Marcus, as if searching for an explanation that would somehow preserve the certainty he had carried only moments earlier. Marcus finally met the sheriff's eyes again, not with satisfaction or anger, but with unmistakable disappointment. "Sheriff," he said gently, "I tried several times to make this morning easier for everyone." For the first time since walking into Miller's diner, Daniel Brooks had no immediate answer. No one inside Miller's diner moved for several long seconds. The words Director Ellington seemed to linger in the air long after they had been spoken, replacing certainty with disbelief. Sheriff Daniel Brooks looked from the federal credentials to Marcus Ellington and then back again, as though repeating the motion might somehow change what stood before him. Deputy Ryan Collins felt his stomach tighten. He had spent years respecting federal procedure, and every detail unfolding inside the diner matched exactly what he had been trained to recognize. The quiet confidence of the arriving agents, their disciplined movements, and the unmistakable respect they showed Marcus left little room for doubt. Angela Brooks stepped closer, her voice remaining calm and professional. "Director, we apologize for the delay. We became concerned when your scheduled check-in did not come through." Marcus answered with the same composed tone that had guided every conversation that morning. "Your response was appropriate. Thank you." Agent David Ross turned politely toward Sheriff Brooks. "Sir, Director Ellington was scheduled to lead a confidential federal coordination meeting this morning." Daniel remained silent, struggling to reconcile the ordinary traveler he believed he had encountered with the senior federal official now standing before him. Marcus did not raise his voice or display frustration. Instead, he looked at Angela. "Would you please ask the sheriff to return my phone? I imagine several people are waiting for updates." Daniel slowly reached into his pocket and removed the phone he had collected only minutes earlier. He handed it back without speaking. Marcus accepted it with a courteous nod. "Thank you." There was no sarcasm in his words, only simple professionalism. Sarah Whitmore watched the exchange with tears beginning to gather in her eyes. She remembered every conversation from the past hour, every polite thank you, every quiet smile Marcus had offered to complete strangers. Nothing about him had changed. The only thing that had changed was what everyone now knew about him. The elderly veteran slowly stood from his booth and removed his cap as Marcus glanced his way. "Sir," he said with quiet respect, "I appreciate your service." Marcus smiled warmly. "Thank you, but today is not about me. It is about remembering that every person deserves dignity before anyone knows their title." Those words settled over the room more heavily than any command ever could. Several customers lowered their eyes, reflecting on everything they had witnessed since breakfast began. Ryan Collins finally spoke, his voice careful and sincere. "Director Ellington, I would like to apologize for my part in what happened today." Marcus looked at the young deputy with understanding. "Deputy, accountability begins with honesty. You remained respectful throughout our interaction. Never lose that." Ryan nodded quietly, visibly relieved, yet deeply thoughtful. Angela Brooks turned toward her team. "Document the timeline exactly as it occurred. Collect available statements from everyone who wishes to provide one." There was no anger in her instructions, only commitment to procedure. The agents immediately began their work with calm professionalism. Sarah agreed to preserve the security camera recording from inside the diner. The construction workers volunteered to provide witness statements. Even the young mother quietly approached an agent and said she wanted to explain everything she had seen from the moment Marcus entered the restaurant. Daniel watched each conversation unfold, realizing that events were moving forward without his control for the first time in many years. Marcus noticed the sheriff standing silently near the entrance. He walked toward him slowly, stopping several feet away. "Sheriff Brooks," he said, "federal authority is not what matters most today." Daniel finally looked up. Marcus continued, "The real question is whether we judge people by facts or by assumptions. Every community faces that choice. Every single day. Daniel lowered his eyes, unable to answer. Outside, word had already begun spreading across Main Street. Curious residents gathered quietly on sidewalks, wondering why several federal vehicles surrounded the small diner. None of them understood the full story yet, but before the morning was over, the conversation throughout the town would no longer be about an unfamiliar visitor eating breakfast. It would be about a lesson that every witness inside Miller's Diner would remember for the rest of their lives, because they had just seen the remarkable difference between someone who relied on authority to earn respect and someone who earned respect long before anyone recognized the authority he carried. By mid-morning, Miller's Diner had become the quiet center of a story that no one in town could have imagined when the first pot of coffee had been poured. Federal agents continued their work with calm precision, speaking respectfully with every customer who had witnessed the morning's events. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, and no rush to conclusions. Every statement was recorded carefully. Every detail was treated with equal importance. Marcus Ellington believed that justice earned public trust only when it followed facts instead of emotions, and his team reflected that principle in every conversation. Sarah Whitmore handed Agent David Ross a secure copy of the diner's surveillance recording. "Everything is there," she said softly, "from the moment he walked through the door until all of you arrived." David accepted it with appreciation. "Thank you, Ms. Whitmore. Your cooperation helps ensure that everyone is treated fairly." Nearby, the elderly veteran completed his witness statement with slow, careful handwriting. The construction workers did the same, describing exactly what they had seen without adding assumptions or opinions. Even the young mother who had been eating breakfast with her daughter chose to speak. She explained how Marcus had greeted everyone with kindness, helped a stranger recover his wallet, and remained respectful during every conversation. Piece by piece, a complete picture of the morning began to emerge. Outside the diner, Mayor Thomas Reed arrived after receiving an urgent call from the town manager. The sight of multiple federal vehicles parked along Main Street immediately told him the situation was far more serious than an ordinary misunderstanding. As he entered the restaurant, Angela Brooks greeted him professionally before briefly explaining that a federal review would now include the events that had occurred inside the diner that morning. The mayor listened carefully before approaching Marcus. "Director Ellington," he said sincerely, "on behalf of this community, I want to express my deepest regret that your visit began this way." Marcus shook his hand politely. "Mayor Reed, communities are not defined by one difficult morning. They are defined by how they respond after the truth becomes clear." The mayor nodded thoughtfully, understanding that those words carried both grace and responsibility. Sheriff Daniel Brooks remained quietly near the entrance, no longer the unquestioned center of attention he had been only an hour earlier. His confidence had given way to reflection as he watched witness after witness describe the same respectful behavior from the man he had chosen to confront. Deputy Ryan Collins stood nearby, saying very little while observing how professionalism looked when practiced without pride. Angela Brooks eventually approached the sheriff with calm courtesy. "Sheriff Brooks, federal policy requires that we preserve all available evidence related to today's incident, including body camera recordings and official documentation. We will coordinate with your department through the appropriate legal channels." Daniel nodded slowly. "You will receive everything that was recorded." There was no argument because procedure left little room for debate. Marcus quietly listened before speaking. "Transparency protects everyone," he said. "It protects citizens, officers, and public trust." Several people standing nearby heard those words and silently nodded in agreement. The lesson reached far beyond one individual or one department. It spoke to every person who carried responsibility over someone else. Before leaving the diner, Marcus walked back to the table where his breakfast still waited untouched. Sarah looked at the cold plate and smiled sadly. "I suppose I owe you a fresh breakfast." Marcus smiled in return. "Only if I pay for it this time." Sarah laughed gently through moist eyes. "Not a chance." The simple exchange eased the tension that had filled the room all morning. For the first time since the sheriff had entered the diner, a few quiet smiles appeared among the customers. Hope slowly replaced discomfort. Outside, townspeople continued gathering along the sidewalks, not to celebrate anyone's embarrassment, but to understand what had happened inside the familiar little restaurant they had visited for years. They would soon learn that the story was never really about titles or federal authority. It was about the consequences of making judgments before seeking understanding. As Marcus prepared to leave for the federal meeting that had been delayed but not forgotten, the morning sun reflected across the courthouse windows, reminding everyone who witnessed that remarkable breakfast that true justice did not arrive with flashing lights or loud speeches. It arrived through patience, truth, accountability, and the quiet courage to let facts speak louder than assumptions. The federal coordination meeting finally began shortly after noon, but for many people in town, the most important lessons of the day had already been learned long before anyone gathered around a conference table. Marcus Ellington entered the municipal building with the same quiet confidence he had carried into Miller's diner that morning. He did not ask for special recognition, and he never mentioned the inconvenience he had experienced. Instead, he thanked the local officials for making time to meet and immediately turned the discussion toward the purpose of his visit, strengthening cooperation between agencies, improving public trust, and ensuring that every community received fair and professional law enforcement. Mayor Thomas Reed listened with renewed attention, realizing that true leadership often revealed itself through restraint rather than authority. Throughout the meeting, Marcus spoke about accountability as a shared responsibility instead of a punishment. He explained that every badge represented a promise, not a privilege, and that public confidence was earned one respectful interaction at a time. His words carried unusual weight because everyone in the room knew what had happened only a few hours earlier. There was no bitterness in his voice, only conviction born from decades of service. Outside the meeting room, federal investigators continued reviewing evidence through established legal procedures, while local officials cooperated fully with every request. Transparency replaced speculation, and facts replaced assumptions. Deputy Ryan Collins found himself reflecting on every moment inside the diner. Before leaving for the day, he quietly approached Marcus one final time. "Director Ellington," he said sincerely, "today reminded me that wearing a uniform does not mean I stop learning." Marcus smiled warmly. "The day we believe we have nothing left to learn is the day we begin losing the trust people place in us." Ryan nodded with genuine appreciation, carrying those words with him long after the conversation ended. Sarah Whitmore reopened Miller's diner that afternoon after the morning crowd had finally dispersed. She placed a fresh pot of coffee on the warmer and looked toward the booth by the window where Marcus had eaten breakfast. She decided not to remove the handwritten receipt she had quietly tucked beneath the sugar dispenser. Across the top, she had written a simple message that read, "Thank you for reminding us what dignity looks like." She knew Marcus would probably never see it, but perhaps someone else sitting there someday would. The elderly veteran returned the following week and chose the same booth. When another traveler walked through the front door, he smiled first instead of wondering where the stranger came from. The construction workers remembered how quickly assumptions could spread and how much courage it took to speak up for someone being treated unfairly. The young mother carried home a lesson that she later shared with her daughter, explaining that kindness should never depend on someone's job title, appearance, or reputation because every person deserved respect before they earned recognition. Even those who had simply watched from a distance found themselves reconsidering how easily confidence could become certainty without understanding. As the sun slowly settled behind the courthouse and another ordinary evening returned to the town, Marcus prepared to leave for his next assignment. Before getting into his vehicle, he paused for a moment and looked back toward Main Street. Small towns, like people, were never defined by their worst moments. They were defined by whether they chose growth after truth was revealed. He smiled quietly, knowing that meaningful change rarely happened through dramatic speeches or public embarrassment. It happened when ordinary people decided that tomorrow would be better than yesterday because they had learned something worth remembering. The convoy pulled away without fanfare, disappearing down the highway as calmly as it had arrived. Life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, but those who had witnessed that remarkable morning understood that something lasting had changed. They no longer measured authority by the badge someone wore or the title printed on a business card. They measured it by patience, humility, fairness, and the willingness to treat every stranger with equal dignity. Because in the end, the greatest test of character is not how we treat the powerful after we recognize them. It is how we treat the ordinary person before we know who they are. And that is where real justice quietly begins.